My uncle called me from the county clerk's office on a Tuesday morning and said the land was gone. He said your grandfather sold the back 40 acres before he died to cover the last round of hospital bills. He said it happened quickly and quietly the way those things happen, and that he was sorry I was finding out now instead of sooner, but that he had been dealing with a great deal since the funeral and had not been organized about the communication timeline. He said this in the smooth tone of a person explaining the weather rather than a decision. He said the rest of the estate was being administered correctly and that my portion of the remaining assets would be distributed within the standard time frame. I said thank you for letting me know. I hung up. I did not feel much of anything for about an hour, and then I felt something specific that I could not name yet. Before I go on, if this story connects with something real in your life, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely feel it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. My name is Sonia. I am 30 years old. And this is the story of how a county recorder's document, a death certificate, and a retired county clerk named Helen, who had been indexing deed records for 31 years, handed me back the 40 acres of land that my grandfather intended me to have, and that my uncle had decided, with a forged signature and a dead woman's notary seal, was already his. Now let me take you back to the beginning, not the Tuesday phone call, before that. To the farm outside Millersport, Ohio, where my grandfather Harold had lived for 67 years and where he had built, with specific and sustained effort across those decades, a working operation that had started as 60 acres of mixed crop and had contracted over time to the 40 that mattered. The back 40 that fronted the creek and that my grandfather had described to me on more than one occasion as the piece of land that makes the rest of it worth having. My grandfather's name was Harold Kessler. He was 83 when he died. He had worked the farm for 67 years, and he had been in the way of men who have spent most of their lives in physical relationship with a specific piece of ground, a person whose identity was inseparable from the land itself. He did not describe himself in terms of personality or achievement. He described himself in terms of what he had built and maintained and what had grown under his particular management. He said once to me when I was about 22 and visiting for a weekend and helping him with something along the fence line, "This land knows me." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means I have been here long enough that the land has adjusted to my way of doing things, and I have adjusted to its way of doing things, and we have an understanding." I said, "That sounds like a marriage." He said, "That is exactly what it is." He did not say this wistfully. He said it as a statement of fact. My Uncle Marcus is my grandfather's son from his first marriage, the marriage before my grandmother. He is 64 years old. He is a person who has had an ongoing and slightly strained relationship with the farm his whole life, close enough to feel entitled to it and far enough from the actual work of it to not fully understand what that entitlement costs. He managed a hardware supply business in Columbus for most of his career and sold it in his mid-50s at a profit that I gathered from various family conversations was smaller than he had hoped. He had a house in a suburb and a retirement that was described as comfortable, but that occasionally required the supplementation of family conversations about assets and what they might eventually produce. He was at my grandfather's house often in the last 2 years of my grandfather's life. He helped with errands and medical appointments. He was useful, and he was present in the visible local way, and my grandfather valued this and said so. I am the daughter of my grandfather's second wife, Ruth's daughter, from her previous marriage, which makes me technically his stepdaughter's daughter and not a blood relation in the direct legal sense, but which makes me in the practical emotional sense his granddaughter in every way that has ever mattered to either of us. My grandmother Ruth died when I was 12. My grandfather continued to treat me exactly as he always had, which is to say as his granddaughter, without qualification and without distance. He called every Sunday. He came to my college graduation. He taught me to drive in his driveway in a truck that had been old when I was a child and was genuinely ancient by then, and that he maintained with the same systematic care he applied to everything he valued. He told me the back 40 was mine when he was gone, in those exact words, from a conversation I am going to tell you about specifically because it matters to what came later. The conversation happened 3 years before he died. He was sitting at his kitchen table and I was visiting for a long weekend and we were having coffee, and he said, "I have updated my will and I want you to know what it says." I said, "Okay." He said, "Marcus will get the farmhouse and the north acreage and the equipment." He said, "The back 40 is yours because you are the one who understands what it means." He said he did not mean that as a criticism of Marcus. He said Marcus understood the farm as a financial asset, and that was a legitimate way to understand a farm, and that he had arranged things so that Marcus would receive the assets that could be liquidated without losing what they were. He said the back 40 could not be liquidated without losing what it was. He said, "You know what that means, and I want it to go to someone who knows." I said, "I am not a farmer, Grandpa." He said, "I know that." He said, "Knowing what something means is not the same as farming it." He said, "You can own it and let someone else farm it and know what you have." I said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." We finished our coffee. My grandfather died in March. I drove to Millersport for the funeral and for the week that followed it, and I was at the farmhouse when the estate attorney came to read the will, and the will said what my grandfather had told me it would say. The back 40 was specifically named and specifically designated to me by description and by parcel identification number. The farmhouse and north acreage and equipment to Marcus, various personal items to various people. It was a clear will, properly executed, and I received my copy, and I thanked the attorney, and I drove home to Columbus where I was working as a physical therapist, and I waited. I waited 4 months. The call came on a Tuesday morning in the 5th month. The land was gone. Sold before he died. Hospital bills. I thanked Marcus for letting me know. I hung up. An hour later, the unnamed feeling became a named feeling, and the name was not grief. The name was specific. My grandfather had told me the back 40 was mine in a conversation I could describe in detail. My grandfather had a will that named it to me by parcel number. My grandfather had been in sufficient health and clarity of mind to have that conversation with me 3 years before his death. He had been in declining but present health for the last year of his life. He had been, according to the hospice nurse who had been present in the last 3 weeks, lucid and communicative until approximately 4 days before he died. He had not mentioned, in any of the conversations I had with him in the last months of his life, selling the back 40. He had mentioned the back 43 times in those months, all 3 times in the context of what I would do with it. I pulled up the Licking County Recorder's website that evening. In Ohio, the county recorder maintains public records of all deed transfers, and these records are searchable by property address and parcel number. I had the parcel number from the copy of the will. I typed it in. There was a deed transfer. It was dated February 19th. My grandfather had died on March 4th. The deed transferred the back 40 from Harold Kessler to Marcus Kessler, not to a third party, not to a hospital payment account, not to a medical debt service, to Marcus. The consideration listed on the deed was $10, which is the standard nominal consideration used in family or gift transfers, not the consideration that would appear on a sale to cover medical bills. The deed was notarized by a woman named Agnes Whitmore, commission number listed dated February 19th. My grandfather had been in hospice care from February 3rd. He had been on a medication protocol from February 8th that the hospice nurse had documented extensively. The February 19th date was 11 days into hospice care and 6 days after the medication increase that the records would later show had significantly affected his cognition and alertness. But that was not the most important. I want to tell you what $10 means on a deed. In Ohio and in most states, a deed can recite any consideration amount the parties agree to. $10 is the nominal consideration used in transfers where no actual payment is exchanged. Family transfers, gift deeds, estate planning documents where property moves between related parties as part of a legal structure that does not involve a market transaction. When a property is sold to cover medical bills or other debts, as Marcus had told me my grandfather had done, the consideration reflects the actual sale price. A 40-acre parcel with creek frontage in Licking County was worth considerably more than $10. It was worth considerably more than a number that would cover the last round of hospital bills for an 83-year-old man in Ohio. $10 on the deed meant the transfer was not a sale. It was not a transaction intended to generate cash for a debt. It was a gift or a family transfer or some other form of no-consideration conveyance, and it transferred the land to Marcus, not to a medical payment system or a hospital or a creditor. Marcus had told me the land was sold to cover hospital bills. The deed said the land was transferred to Marcus for $10. These two things were not compatible. I wrote this on my legal pad in large letters and circled it and moved on to the notarization. That was when I found Agnes Whitmore. The Meadow Ridge staff knew my grandmother as Mrs. Agnes, and they called her that consistently through the 3 years she was there. And I found this respectful in the specific way of institutions that take the personhood of their residents seriously, rather than as a matter of policy. She was Mrs. Agnes to them, and she had been Mrs. Agnes to the world, and she was still Mrs. Agnes when she died, and I carry her with me in that form. The most important thing I found that night was when I looked up Agnes Whitmore's Notary Commission in the Ohio Secretary of State's database. Notary commissions in Ohio are public records. Agnes Whitmore, commission number as listed on the deed, had held a commission through the Licking County area. I searched her name. I found her commission record. Her commission had been renewed last in 2019. Her commission had been valid through April 2024. The deed was dated February 2023. That part was fine, but when I searched Agnes Whitmore more specifically, I found an obituary. Agnes Whitmore of Granville, Ohio, had died on October 3, 2022. 4 months before the deed she had supposedly notarized. A dead woman's notary seal had been used on a deed dated 4 months after she died. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table in Columbus with my laptop and a legal pad, and I wrote down everything I had found in the specific sequence I had found it. Deed transfer to Marcus, not to a third party. Nominal consideration, not a sale price. Agnes Whitmore, commission valid. Agnes Whitmore died October 2022. Deed dated February 2023. Agnes Whitmore could not have notarized that deed. Someone had used a deceased notary seal and commission number to falsify a notarization on a property transfer. The property was land my grandfather's will had left to me. The transfer had been recorded with the county recorder during the period when my grandfather was in hospice care under a medication protocol that affected his cognition. I called a property and estate attorney named Carolyn Desai the next morning. Her office was in Columbus, and she had been recommended to me by a colleague at the physical therapy practice who had used her in a real estate dispute. I told Carolyn what I had found. She was quiet for a long. I want to tell you what it was like to sit at my kitchen table the night I found the obituary. I have described the factual sequence, but the experience of it had a quality that I want to describe more completely. When I found the deed transfer, I felt something that was close to dread. Not because I was surprised that Marcus might have done something wrong, but because finding the deed meant the intuition I had been carrying since the phone call was correct, and having an intuition confirmed is not the same as being glad about it. I had not wanted to be right about this. When I found the Agnes Whitmore obituary, the feeling changed into something I can only describe as clarity. Not relief, not triumph, clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you have been looking at a complicated situation and trying to determine whether it has an innocent explanation, and you find the thing that removes the possibility of an innocent explanation permanently. Agnes Whitmore had died 4 months before the deed was dated. There was no version of that which was an honest mistake. You do not accidentally use a dead person's notary seal. You do not accidentally write a dead person's commission number on a deed. You either knew she was dead or you did not know, and if you did not know, you had not checked, and if you had not checked, you had not tried to find a real notary, which means you were not trying to do this correctly. The clarity of that was not pleasant, but it was complete. I printed the obituary. I printed the commission record. I put them with the deed in a folder. I looked at the folder for a while. I thought about my grandfather telling me the land knows me and we have an understanding. I went to bed. In the morning, I called Carolyn. I also want to say that I do not hold Renata responsible for any of this. She told me something at a dinner table without knowing what she was telling me. The credit for finding the record belongs to the county auditor who built a public portal, and to my instinct to look it up. Renata gave me the thread to pull. I pulled it. The time when I finished. Then she said, I need you to send me everything you just described. The deed from the recorder's website, the notary commission search, the obituary. She said, I also need you to tell me about the hospice records, whether they are accessible and whether they document the medication timeline. I said the hospice agency had provided my mother with a copy of the care summary, and I thought I could get it. She said, get it. She said this is not a complicated case in terms of what happened. She said it may be a complicated case in terms of family. I said, I understand. Carolyn filed a quiet title action in Licking County Court of Common Pleas. She submitted the deed as recorded. She submitted the Ohio Secretary of State Notary Commission record showing Agnes Whitmore's commission. She submitted Agnes Whitmore's death certificate, which she had obtained from the Ohio Vital Records Office. She submitted the hospice care summary documenting my grandfather's condition and medication status on February 19th, which showed that he had been assessed as having significantly diminished decision-making capacity on that date. She submitted a copy of my grandfather's will naming me as the recipient of the parcel. She submitted a sworn statement from me regarding the conversation 3 years before his death in which he had told me directly what his intentions were. Marcus's attorney filed a response arguing that the deed had been validly executed and that any notarization issues were clerical in nature and did not affect the validity of the transfer. He argued that my grandfather had expressed to Marcus his intention to transfer the land in settlement of what he owed Marcus for years of care and assistance. He argued that the hospice documentation did not constitute proof that my grandfather lacked capacity on the specific day the deed was executed. He did not address the Agnes Whitmore death certificate directly in the initial filing. The judge in the case was a common pleas judge named Alan Torres, who had been on the bench for 18 years. Carolyn said he was a judge who read everything carefully and who had specific and well-developed opinions about what constituted valid notarization and what did not. She said he would ask about Agnes Whitmore. He asked about Agnes Whitmore in the first hearing, on the record, and directed Marcus's attorney to provide an explanation of how a notarization had been obtained from a person who had been dead for 4 months at the time the document was supposedly executed. Marcus's attorney asked for additional time to investigate the discrepancy. Judge Torres gave him 14 days. 14 days later, Marcus's attorney filed a supplemental response that described the notarization as having been obtained from a different notary whose seal had the same commission number due to an administrative error in the Secretary of State's records, and that the signature was that of a notary named Ann Whiting rather than Agnes Whitmore, and that the similarity in names had created a confusion in the records. Carolyn's response was 8 pages. She obtained from the Ohio Secretary of State's office a complete list of all active and recently expired notary commissions in Licking County for the relevant period. There was no Ann Whiting. There was no administrative error producing duplicate commission numbers. The commission number on the deed belonged to Agnes Whitmore, who had died in October 2022. The notarization was fraudulent. Judge Torres ruled on a Friday. I want to tell you what happened when Judge Torres asked Marcus's attorney to explain Agnes Whitmore. Carolyn described the hearing to me afterward with the specific precision of an attorney who has been in enough hearings to understand which moments are the ones that change the direction of a proceeding. She said Judge Torres read the Agnes Whitmore material carefully before he said anything. She said he looked at the deed. He looked at the commission record. He looked at the death certificate. He looked at all 3 in sequence, and then he set them down, and he looked at Marcus's attorney and he asked, in the specific neutral tone of a judge who wants to see what the answer is going to be before he decides what he thinks of it, "Can you explain the notarization on this deed?" Carolyn said Marcus's attorney gave an answer that she would describe as the answer of a person who does not have the answer. He said he would need to investigate. The judge said 14 days. Marcus's attorney came back in 14 days with the Ann Whiting theory, the argument about similar names and administrative errors in the Secretary of State's records. Carolyn said when she read that response, she knew they had won. She said the Ann Whiting theory was the argument of a person who had nothing left and was building something out of the remaining materials. She submitted the complete notary list for Licking County, and there was no Ann Whiting and no administrative error producing duplicate numbers, and the commission number on the deed belonged to Agnes Whitmore, and Agnes Whitmore had died in October 2022, and that was the end of the argument available to Marcus, and the beginning of the end of the case. Judge Torres ruled on a Friday. Carolyn called me at work and said, "It is what we needed." I said, "Thank you." She said, "The land is yours." Order voided the deed on the grounds of fraudulent execution, specifically the use of a notarization obtained through the fraudulent use of a deceased notary's credentials. He found that the deed as recorded was legally void from its inception. He ordered the property returned to the estate for administration under the terms of the will. He referred the matter to the county prosecutor and to the Ohio Attorney General's office given the fraudulent use of a deceased person's professional credentials. I was at work when Carolyn called. I was in the middle of a session with a patient, and I stepped into the hallway and she said the ruling came through and it is what we needed. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Congratulations." I said, "Is it a congratulations situation?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "It is a complicated situation that resolved correctly, and that is the thing to hold on to." I said, "Yes." I went back to my patient. I finished my shift. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen with the specific quality of a person who has been carrying something for 8 months and has set it down and is learning what it feels like to have that weight redistributed. Marcus and I have not spoken since the hearing. His attorney and Carolyn had a conversation about the referral and Marcus's exposure, and I was not party to it, and Carolyn said she would tell me if anything changed that I needed to know about. So far, nothing has changed that I need to know about. I hold the question of what happens between Marcus and me the way I hold other questions that require more time than I currently have, which is with a specific patience that does not mean absence of feeling, but means I am not yet ready to have the feeling completely. The back 40 is mine now. On paper and in the county recorder's records and in the estate distribution that Carolyn supervised, and in the specific sense that things are yours when a judge has read the evidence and signed an order saying they are. I have not been to the farm since the funeral. I have spoken with the tenant farmer who has worked the back 40 under a lease arrangement for several years and who was understandably uncertain about the status of things during the dispute and who is now, with the estate settled and the title clear, continuing to farm the land under a new lease that I have signed with him. His name is Dale. He called me after the settlement to say he was glad things had worked out. He said your grandfather always said you were the one who knew what the land meant. I said, I know. He said, that's not a common thing. I said, no. He said, I hope you'll come out sometime. I said I will, and I will. I want to say something before I go. I want to say something about what it means to inherit land specifically, as distinct from inheriting money or objects. Land is the kind of thing that does not fit neatly into a box or an envelope. It exists in a place. It has a physical reality that precedes you and will follow you. It has a specific quality of persistence. The 11 acres in Greene County were there before my grandfather bought them, and they were there while he owned them, and they were there while my grandmother maintained them, and they were there when Bernard filed a false inventory, and they were there while I was in Cincinnati believing they were not there, and they are there now. The creek has been running along the southern boundary since well before 1962, and it is running still. The hardwood trees that were there when my grandfather chose the parcel for their shade are taller now because that is what hardwood trees do in 60 years. The meadow has been cut annually by the management company my grandmother paid, and it is still a meadow. None of this was affected by the deed fraud. The land did not know it had been fraudulently transferred. It continued to be what it was, regardless of what the deed said, because it is land, and land does not require a correct deed to persist. What the deed fraud affected was the record, and the record was corrected. Now the record and the land say the same thing again, which is my name, which is what my grandmother intended when she kept paying the taxes and the management fee and maintained the folder in the filing cabinet for 61 years. I have not been to see it yet. I am going in the spring when, not about Marcus, not about the attorney or the hearing or the judge's order, about Agnes Whitmore. About a woman who had held a notary commission in Licking County for years, and who had done her work correctly and carefully, and who had died in October of 2022, and whose commission number had been used 4 months after her death on a fraudulent deed. She did not know this would happen. She could not have known. She was not there to prevent it. But the record of her was there. The death certificate was there. The Secretary of State's commission records were there. The county recorder's deed with the commission number was there. The three things together said what they said, and what they said could not be explained away by an attorney's supplemental filing about administrative errors that did not exist. Agnes Whitmore's death was a public fact. It was recorded in a vital records office and searchable in a database, and it held. The document that was supposed to make my grandfather's land permanently disappear into my uncle's name held a commission number that belonged to a dead woman, and the dead woman's public records were still there, intact, complete, and specific. She did her work carefully when she was alive. Her records did the rest. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story made you feel something, write it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to hear the story of a woman whose business partner had been registering their jointly built company's intellectual property in his name only for 3 years, and what the filing timestamps revealed, it is waiting for you in the description below. Click it. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and if someone tells you that land was sold before a person died, look at who it was sold to and what the deed says the price was. $10 is not a sale price. $10 is something else entirely. I want to tell you about the night I found the auditor's listing at Renata's apartment in more detail than I gave you earlier. Because the moment of finding something matters to the story, and I want you to understand what it was like to be sitting at her kitchen table with a glass of wine and my phone, and to type my uncle's name into the Greene County property search, and to see what came up. It was not a dramatic discovery in the way that discoveries are sometimes described. My hands did not shake. I did not gasp. What happened was much quieter and in some ways more unsettling. I looked at the screen and I read the listing and I read it again, and I understood what I was looking at, and I went very still inside in the specific way that you go still when you understand that something you believed was true is not true, and that understanding this changes the shape of what you know about a period of your life. The property was there. It was listed under an LLC with his initials. The acquisition date was February of the year my grandmother died. I had been at the will reading in November. It was now December. The property had been transferred in between. While I was in Cincinnati believing that the land was gone because of a lien default 20 years ago, the land had already been moved. I said to Renata, I need to make a call tomorrow morning, and she refilled my glass and asked if I was okay, and I said, I think I will be. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in my apartment in Cincinnati, and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about the will reading and the lawyer's office in Dayton and the word nothing. I thought about it being said across a table by a person who had already done the thing he was describing as a historical accident. I thought about the specific calculation in that, the assessment that I would not check, the confidence that the word nothing would be sufficient. I do not know if I was angry that night. I think I was something that was not quite anger yet, and that became anger over the following days as the shape of it became clearer. That night it was more like the specific cold feeling of understanding that you have been miscounted, that someone looked at what you were and decided you would not notice. My mother found out what was happening about 3 months into the legal process. I had not told her immediately because I did not know how to tell her, and because I was still gathering documents, and I did not want to disrupt what I was building with a conversation I was not ready to have. She found out because Susan sent a formal letter to Bernard as part of the legal notification process, and Bernard called my mother. She called me the same evening. She said, "What is happening?" I said, "I need to explain some things." I explained them. She was very quiet on the phone in a way that was different from her usual quietness. When I finished, she said I did not know about this. I said, "I know, Mom." She said he told me the land was gone years ago. I said he told me the same thing at the will reading. She said I do not know how to have this conversation with him. I said you do not have to have it on my behalf. I said Susan is handling it. She said I am sorry this happened to you. I said I know. She said your grandfather would be very angry. I said I know that too. She said take care of yourself. I said I will. I want to also tell you about the specific experience of reading a chain of title report. If you have not encountered one before, which most people have not because most people do not often need them, it is a dense document organized chronologically that lists every recorded instrument affecting a piece of real property from the original conveyance onward. Each entry shows the type of document, the parties involved, the date it was recorded, the book and page number in the County Recorder's Index, and a brief description of what the document does. Reading mine was the experience of reading a complete history of a piece of land across 61 years compressed into 12 pages of precise indexing. I could see the 1962 deed, my grandfather's name as grantee, the legal description of the 11 acres. I could see various administrative filings over the decades. I could see the lien recorded in 1994. I could see 2 pages later the release of that lien in 1998, signed by the creditor, confirming that the debt had been fully satisfied and the claim against the property was discharged. I could see the years of quiet ownership with no further entries, nothing happening on the record because nothing needed to happen, the land simply existing in the county index as belonging to my grandmother. And then the entry in February of the year after she died, the deed executed by Bernard as executor, the grantee listed as his LLC, the stated consideration, $1. 12 pages of history, and then that. The shape of it was very clear. There is a detail I have not mentioned about the probate process that Susan raised and that I found illuminating. When an executor files an estate inventory with the probate court, that inventory is a sworn document. The executor signs it under oath, attesting that the inventory is a complete and accurate listing of all estate assets. Bernard had filed an inventory that described the Greene County property as having been previously disposed of, which removed it from the inventory as an estate asset. Susan said that statement in the inventory was false because the chain of title showed the property in my grandmother's name at the date of her death. She said filing a false sworn document in probate court is not merely a civil matter. It is the kind of thing that county prosecutors review with specific interest. She said the court referral to the prosecutor was not a formality. She said it was a meaningful referral. I asked what that meant in practical terms. She said she could not predict outcomes, but she said that Judge Haley had seen the same sequence of documents that we had seen: the timing of the LLC registration, the $1 transfer, the false inventory entry, and that her decision to refer to the prosecutor suggested she found the sequence as legible as we did. I want to say something about Renata because I have not fully said it yet, and she deserves to be in this story as clearly as she is in my life. She did not know what she was giving me when she mentioned her father's property in Greene County. She said it as the careless thing you say when you are describing your father's ordinary life and you have no reason to believe a piece of it contains what it contained. When I found the listing on her phone and she saw my face change, she did not ask me to explain it immediately, and she did not push when I said I needed to make a call. She refilled my glass and she let me sit with what I had found. In the months that followed, she was in the position of being Bernard's daughter and my cousin and the person who had unknowingly triggered the whole investigation, and she held that position with a grace that I have thought about many times. She never made it about herself. She never asked me to protect her from what I was doing. She said once that she had not known what her father had done and that she wished she had known because she would have told me, and I believe her. I believe her because I know her and because that is the person she is. The 11 acres have a creek running along the southern edge that my grandfather specifically chose the property for. The creek is called a named creek on county maps, which means it appears in the county's geographic index as a named waterway. I found this in the chain of title description of the property, which includes the meets and bounds description with a reference to the named creek as a southern boundary marker. I had never heard of the creek before reading the chain of title. I looked it up on a county map and there it is, a thin blue line along the bottom of the parcel, ordinary and permanent and old. My grandfather stood on that land in 1962 and looked at the creek and made a decision. The decision is in the public record. The creek is in the public record. The 61 years of taxes paid and maintained and properly documented are in the public record. And the $1 transfer that tried to end the story is also in the public record, in the same index, recorded with the same permanence as everything else, which is what made it visible and what made it voidable and what made it possible for the record to say, in the end, that what had been taken had to go back. I want to tell you about the 14 months between when I found the auditor's listing at Renata's kitchen table and when Judge Haley ruled from the bench. They were not 14 months of constant activity. There were long stretches of waiting, of living my ordinary life in Cincinnati while the case moved through the stages it moves through, with periods of intense documentation and filing, followed by extended periods of procedural processing that required nothing from me directly but that were always there as a thing I was carrying. I went to work. I had dinners with friends. I called my mother on Sundays, which was complicated because my mother was Bernard's sister, and she knew what was happening, and she had the specific difficulty of a person whose brother has done something she cannot defend, and whose daughter is in the process of proving it, and who loves both of them and does not know how to inhabit that position. I did not ask her to take sides. She did not offer to take sides. We talked around the center of it, and we were both glad to hear the other's voice, and that was the shape of those calls for 14 months. Renata and I talked about it once directly, about halfway through the process. We met for coffee, and she said, "I have known something was wrong for a while, and I have not known what to do about it." I said, "I understand that." She said, "I am not going to pretend I know why he did this." I said, "I do not need you to explain him to me." She said, "I am sorry this happened." I said, "I know." She said, "I hope it does not change what we are to each other." I said, "It has not changed what we are to each other. The person who did this is not you." She looked relieved in the specific way of someone who has been carrying an anticipated verdict and has just heard it read correctly. We finished our coffee and talked about other things. That conversation has remained as it was. Susan Park was 45 years old when I first walked into her office, and she had a quality of focused intelligence that did not perform itself. She wore her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she put them on when she was reading and took them off when she was talking, and the alternation communicated that she was giving both the documents and the conversation their full appropriate attention. She had been doing real property and estate law for 17 years. She had worked on deed fraud cases before, and she said the thing about deed fraud is that it leaves its evidence in the most reliable place possible, which is the public record. Because in order to take title to something, you have to record a deed, and once you record a deed, you have created a permanent entry in the county index that does not go away. She said the person who transfers property through a fraudulent deed is making a permanent record of what they did and filing it at the county courthouse. She said that specific irony never gets old. I said, no, it does not. I want to tell you something about the hearing that I have not mentioned in the procedural account. When Judge Haley asked Bernard's attorney to produce the documentation of the 2001 sale, there was a pause in the courtroom that had a specific texture. Not a dramatic pause in the theatrical sense, a functional pause. The attorney said the documentation was not in a form that had been preserved. The pause that followed was the pause of everyone in the room understanding simultaneously that a property sale in 2001 in Ohio would have been recorded as a deed at the county recorder. And the county recorder's records from 2001 are preserved because the county recorder preserves all deed records. And if there was no recorded deed from 2001, there was no sale. From 2001, the attorney knew this, and the judge knew this, and Susan knew this, and I knew this. And the pause was everyone sitting with that knowledge in a room where it had just become undeniable. Judge Haley said she would like a moment. She looked at her papers for approximately 45 seconds. Then she ruled. There is a detail about the probate process that Susan raised that I found illuminating and that I want to share. When an executor files an estate inventory with the probate court, that inventory is a sworn document. The executor signs it under oath, attesting that it is a complete and accurate listing of all estate assets. Bernard had filed an inventory that described the Greene County property as having been previously disposed of, which removed it from the inventory as an estate asset. Susan said that statement was false because the chain of title showed the property in my grandmother's name at the date of her death. She said filing a false sworn statement in probate court is not merely a civil matter. It is the kind of thing that county prosecutors review with specific interest. She said the court referral to the prosecutor was not a formality. I asked what that meant practically. She said she could not predict outcomes, but she said that Judge Haley had seen the same sequence we had seen, and her decision to refer suggested she found the sequence as legible as we did. I have been thinking about my grandfather Warren a great deal since the case resolved, about the specific decision he made in 1962 to put his savings into 11 acres with a creek because he believed that a property with running water is always worth more than you paid for it. About my grandmother Agnes maintaining those property taxes for 61 years across 2 ownerships, about the folder in the filing cabinet she kept with the deed and the survey and the lien correspondence and the release. About 2 people tending something across a lifetime because they believed it was worth tending. I did not have access to the folder, which was lost when the storage unit was emptied after my grandmother died. What I had instead was the public record, which my grandfather's ownership had created in 1962, and which had been maintained by the county recorder without interruption, and which held the lien release from 1998 and did not hold any deed of sale from 2001, because there was no deed of sale from 2001. The record held what was true and held it permanently, and in a form accessible to anyone who knew to look and who paid $300 and waited 3 days for a title company to pull the documents together. I want to tell you about Millersport, Ohio, because the setting matters in a one-what. I want to say something about what the county recorder's website is and what it contains because I think most people do not know this exists in the form it exists. In Ohio, the county recorder maintains a searchable public database of every deed transfer ever recorded in that county. If you own property in Ohio, or if you inherit property in Ohio, or if you expect to inherit property in Ohio, you can go to the county recorder's website right now and search the parcel number and find every deed transfer that has ever been recorded for that property, who transferred it to whom, when, for what consideration, with what notarization. It takes about 2 minutes. It is free. It is available to anyone with a device and an internet connection. I had not done this before the night after Marcus's phone call. I did not know I should do it. I did not know it was available. I found out it was available because I sat at my kitchen table and thought about what I would need to know, and I typed Licking County Recorder Deed Search into a browser, and the website came up in the first result, and I put in the parcel number from my copy of the will, and the deed transfer came up in about 20 seconds. If you are watching this and you have a parcel number for any property that is supposed to be coming to you from anyone's estate, the county recorder's website is there. You can look 2 minutes. What it says will either confirm that things are as you were told, or it will say something different. Either way, you will know. Not knowing is not the safer option. It is just the less informed one. My grandfather believed land with running water is always worth more than you paid for it. He was right about the money. I think he also meant something beyond the money, and I think what he meant was that some things hold their value in ways that cannot be accounted for on a spreadsheet, and that you know what they are when you are standing next to the water and listening. I have not stood next to the water yet. I will in the spring, and I will find out then what the rest of it means. That is not incidental to the story. It is a small village in Licking County east of Columbus near Buckeye Lake, in the particular part of Ohio that has not been substantially changed by the expansion of the city, and that retains the specific agricultural character of a place where people have been farming the same land for multiple generations. The farms there are not large corporate operations. They are the kind of farms that have names that come from the families who have owned them. The kind of farms where the same family has made the same seasonal decisions about the same fields for 50 or 60 or in some cases 100 years. My grandfather had been part of that particular continuity. His father had farmed a portion of the same acreage. Harold had added to it and improved it and contracted it strategically as age and market made their various demands, and what remained when he died was the specific 60 acres he had decided were the core of what he had built, and that he had chosen to distribute with the clarity of a man who had spent a lifetime thinking carefully about the relationship between land and the people who work it. The back 40 was specifically the 40 acres that fronted Buckeye Creek. It was good soil, the kind that produces reliably across most of the relevant crop varieties in that part of Ohio, and it had the creek as a water source that made it more valuable than land of similar quality without riparian access. It had a tree line along the creek that my grandfather had maintained with a specific philosophy about the relationship between good farming and good ecological stewardship that he had developed over decades, and that he occasionally articulated to me in the direct, specific way he articulated things he had thought through carefully. He said once that you do not own land. You manage it for the period when it falls under your care, and then someone else manages it, and the question is whether they find it better or worse than you left it. He said this was also true of most other things. I found this useful then and more useful since. My grandmother Ruth had been my grandfather's second wife, and she had been, in the way of second wives who come to an established household with their own established family, a person who did not replace the existing structure but added to it in ways that took time to settle into their correct form. My grandmother and I had a relationship that was warm and specific before she died when I was 12, and after her death, my grandfather's relationship with me did not decrease. If anything, it became more central. He had, I think, decided at some point that I was the person in his family who most understood what he understood about what mattered, and that this understanding was not dependent on blood relationship. He made this clear in ways that were specific and practical rather than sentimental. He taught me things. He included me in decisions that were not mine to make, but that he wanted me to understand the reasoning behind. He told me the back 40 was mine 3 years before he died because he believed in informing people clearly about what was coming so that they could prepare for it rather than being surprised. I want to tell you about Dale, the tenant farmer who has worked the back 40 for 11 years. I have since had several conversations with Dale that were not possible during the dispute. Because during the dispute, the status of the land was unclear, and Dale was in the awkward position of not knowing who his actual landlord was or would be, and of having a lease that was technically in question. After the settlement, I called him, and we spoke for about 40 minutes, and it was the most useful conversation I had in the months following the ruling. Dale has been farming in Licking County for 23 years. He is a practical person with the specific practicality of someone who has had to be practical about things that other people find complicated. He knew my grandfather for the full 11 years he farmed the back 40, and he described him with a combination of respect and directness that felt entirely accurate. He said Harold was a man who knew what he had and knew what he wanted to do with it. He said Harold had mentioned me to him more than once in the context of what would happen with the land after. He said Harold said his granddaughter understood land the way some people understand music, not because she played an instrument, but because she knew what she was hearing when she heard it. I found this description very precise. I have never farmed anything. I grew up in Columbus, but I have sat on that creek bank since I was old enough to be taken there. And I have understood what my grandfather meant when he said the land knows me, and I have understood it in the specific way of knowing something that you cannot fully explain, but that you do not doubt. Dale also told me something that I had not known. He said that in the weeks before my grandfather went into hospice care, Marcus had come out to the property twice and had walked the back 40, and that on the second visit he had brought someone Dale described as a man with a briefcase who walked the perimeter and took photographs. Dale said he had not thought much of it at the time. Property owners brought people through for various reasons, but that in retrospect the timing was notable. He said he had mentioned this to the estate attorney during the proceedings when asked if he had seen anything unusual in that period. Dale said it matter-of-factly without drama, the way a person reports an observed fact that they have decided is someone else's job to interpret. I said thank you for telling the attorney. He said of course. He said Harold would have wanted someone looking out for the land. The hospice records were one of the most significant pieces of documentation in the case after the Agnes Whitmore death certificate. The hospice agency had assigned my grandfather a nurse named Rosa, who had been working hospice care for 17 years and who kept documentation with a thoroughness that Carolyn described as exceptional. Rosa had recorded my grandfather's cognitive status on every visit. She had noted the medication adjustment on February 8th, had documented his response to it over the following days, and had specifically noted on February 19th that the patient was primarily sleeping, responding minimally to verbal stimulation, and that family members present should not expect meaningful interaction. The entry for February 19th was time-stamped at 2:14 in the afternoon, which was 7 hours after the deed was allegedly executed and notarized in the morning. The documentation did not say he was incapable of having signed something in the morning. It said he was minimally responsive in the afternoon. Carolyn used this carefully, not as proof of incapacity, but as context for a broader picture that also included the fraudulent notarization and the nominal consideration and the timing itself. I want to tell you about the moment I found the Agnes Whitmore obituary. I had already found the deed transfer, and I was doing what I do when I am trying to understand something, which is to follow each piece of information to the next piece of information and see where the chain leads. I had found the commission number. I had searched it in the Secretary of State's database and found it valid for the relevant period, which initially seemed to close a potential avenue. And then I searched Agnes Whitmore's name more specifically, not the commission, just the name. And the second result in the search was an obituary from a Granville, Ohio local news site dated October 2022. I clicked it. I read it. I read the name at the top and the date at the top, and I looked at the date on the deed on my other browser tab, and I understood in a very short time what I was looking at. There are moments when a piece of information reorganizes everything around it. This was one of those moments. Agnes Whitmore had died in October 2022. The deed was dated February 2023. Whatever had been pressed onto that deed, whatever seal had been used, whatever commission number had been written in, Agnes Whitmore had not been in a position to press a seal onto anything in February 2023 because she had been dead for 4 months. The chain of documentation that was supposed to make a property transfer legitimate, the deed and the notarization and the commission number and the recorded filing, had a break in it that could not be explained or repaired. The break was a death certificate filed in a public vital records office in October 2022 that was still there and still accurate and still said what it said, regardless of how many documents had been filed around it in the intervening months. I printed the obituary that night. I printed the commission record. I printed the deed. I put them in a folder with the will. I placed the folder on my kitchen table and I looked at it for a while and I thought about my grandfather telling me the land knows me and I have been here long enough that we have an understanding. I thought about the tree line along the creek that he had maintained for decades. I thought about Dale walking the 40 with his dog in the mornings I had been there for visits and had seen them from the window of the farmhouse and thought this is what land under care looks like. I thought about Agnes Whitmore, who had done her work correctly for years and who was dead and whose death was a public record and whose commission number had been put on a document after she was no longer alive to know about it. I put the folder in my bag. I went to bed. I called Carolyn in the morning. Carolyn Desai was 42 years old and had been practicing property and estate law in Columbus for 14 years. She had a specific and focused quality to her attention that I associated with people who have learned that most problems yield to careful examination, and that the careful examination requires clearing away everything that is not directly relevant and looking at what remains. She was not expressive in the way that some attorneys are expressive, with theatrical dismay at opposing arguments or visible enthusiasm at favorable evidence. She was steady. When I laid out the Agnes Whitmore finding in our first call, she said, "I am going to need the obituary and the commission record and the deed side by side, and we are going to confirm the commission number matches exactly. And then I am going to obtain the death certificate, and then we are going to file." She did not say it is clear or this is a slam dunk or anything that implied the case was already resolved. She said, "Here's the next step and then the step after that." I found this more reassuring than optimism would have been. The quiet title action proceeded over the course of approximately 8 months from filing to ruling. 8 months is not a long time in legal proceedings, but it is a medium amount of time in the life of a person who is working full-time and making patient care decisions all day, and going home to a kitchen table where a folder with a deed and an obituary has been living since the night she found them. I thought about the case most mornings in the specific, unfocused way that ongoing, unresolved things occupy the background of a person's attention, not constantly in the foreground, but present, always retrievable, always the thing the mind returns to when there is nothing more immediately pressing to think about. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my mother during those 8 months. My mother is Ruth's daughter from her first marriage, and she had known my grandfather as a step-parent for 25 years and had a relationship with him that was warm and that I think he valued in ways he did not always say directly, but that were evident in the specific way he made space for her in his family structure, even when doing so required navigating the complexity of family relationships that do not fit neatly into the categories available. She had the hospice summary because she had been at my grandfather's bedside for the last weeks, and she had been given a copy of the care records as a family member. When I called and explained what I needed and why, she found the file and sent it without asking a series of questions first. She said, "I always thought something was off about the way Marcus handled things." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because when I was at the hospital in those last weeks, Marcus kept asking about the property, and Harold could barely track a conversation, and Marcus kept asking anyway." She said, "I thought at the time he was just anxious about the estate, the way some people get anxious about practical things when they are facing loss." She said, "I wonder now if it was a different kind of anxiety." I said, "Yes." I said, "I wonder the same thing."